who's joining Simon and I this evening. Welcome if you're a regular, as it were, and a special welcome too if this is your first one. We hope you enjoy your evening, but we also hope you didn't have too much trouble with the technology. So if you've got this far, clearly that's fine. My name is Jeff Cowton. I'm the Curator and the Head of Learning at the Wordsworth Trust, as we are now known as Wordsworth Grasmere. I'm in the reading room of the Jerwood Centre. This is the research centre, if you don't know it, next to Dove Cottage, where we have 70,000 books, manuscripts, pictures centred around the lives and writing of William and Dorothy Wordsworth and the other wider romantics. And behind me, as well as the reflections of the lights, you can see some of the early first editions of Wordsworth. And we'll be looking at one or two things from the collection tonight. And of course, some of our greatest treasures are Dorothy Wordsworth's Grasmere journals. And if we look to that day, the 12th of November, 1801, we find that Dorothy describes it as a beautiful, still, sunshiny morning. We rose very late. I put the rag boxes into order. We walked out while the goose was roasting. We walked to the top of the hill. Mary and I followed William. He was walking upon the turf between John's Grove and the lane. It was a most sweet noon. We did not go into John's Grove, but we walked among the rocks, and there we sat. Mr. Olive passed Mary and me upon the road, William still among the rocks. The lake beautiful from the orchard. William and I walked out before tea. The crescent moon. We sat in the slate quarry. I sat there a long time, alone. And in those 4 sentences, there are 5 mentions of the word walk or walking. And it's interesting that they walk together, and then Dorothy clearly is alone at the end. So there's a very nice sort of mixture of social and solitary walking there. My co-host this evening is Professor Simon Bainbridge of Lancaster University, who will be introducing himself shortly, and he'll also be introducing Kerry. Hannah may have mentioned it, but what we encourage you to do as we're going along, as well as comments, is to contribute questions. And as the outline that Hannah's shown in the second half of the evening, that's where particularly we can pick up any comments that we haven't managed to include so far. So please do comments or questions. We'd love to have them, and we'll include as many as we can. We're recording the event this evening, but it's only our faces and our voices that is recorded. So we hope that's all right with everybody. And now, without further ado, hand over to Simon.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Kerry. I'm Simon Bainbridge, so I work at Lancaster University. I'm a trustee of the Wordsworth Trust, and I've also been the lead educator on the online course William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. And it's very nice to see a number of people in the chat who recognise their names, and in fact they've said hello as ex-attendees of that course. And I know that a number of those people were very excited about today, because Dorothy Wordsworth was a very popular part of that course and is sure to be a major figure for us today. So Kerry Andrews is Senior Lecturer in English Literature at Edge Hill University and is a keen hill walker and member of Mountaineering Scotland. She's held positions at the University of Strathclyde, Nottingham Trent University and the Open University. Kerry specialises in 18th century and early Romantic era literature, and also has broader research interests in women's writing, print culture and textual editing. A key part of her work is the determination to return to scholarly and wider attention to the writing of women who've been ignored or neglected in accounts of literary history. She's published work on the 18th century novelist and poet Charlotte Smith, the labouring class writer Anne Yearsley, and her patron Hannah More. Her first book, Anne Yearsley and Hannah More, Patronage and Poetry, The Story of a Literary Relationship, was nominated for the British Association of Romantic Studies First Book Prize in 2015. In 2014, she published the first scholarly edition of Anne Yearsley's complete works. Kerry is principal investigator on a project to digitally publish all 1,800 of Hannah More's surviving letters, which can be found at hannahmoreletters.co.uk. So her new book, and very fine book it is too, beautifully produced, as you can see, Wanderers, A History of Women Walking, is about 10 women over the past 300 years who have found walking essential to their sense of themselves as people and as writers. Wanderers offers an alternative view of the history of walking, guiding us through the different ways of seeing, articulated by these 10 trailblazing women, which include Dorothy Wordsworth, Nan Shepherd, Linda Cracknell, and Virginia Woolf. So I think in our discussion, Jeff and I are going to tend to focus on 4 of the writers studied early in the book: Dorothy Wordsworth, Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, Ellen Wheaton, and Harriet Martinez, because they link most closely with the collection at Wordsworth Grasmere. But if you have questions about the other writers, please do send those in, and I'm sure Kerry will be happy to answer those too, and also to expand on the questions, taking into account the whole book. So congratulations, Kerry. I really enjoyed reading the book. I know it's doing terrifically well at the moment as well. It keeps selling out on Amazon. I noticed it really does seem like the perfect Christmas present to me. I shall certainly be buying it for a few family and friends. So, and obviously I'm very excited to be talking to you tonight, because this also overlaps with research interests of my own. But I want to ask you just first of all, can you tell us a bit about what prompted you to write the book, the inspiration behind this great project?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me tonight. It's a real treat to see all the people who've come from so many different places. That's just so exciting. So thank you very much. The book started from me getting quite annoyed at Robert Macfarlane, if I'm honest. I was reading The Old Ways, and I really enjoy the way Robert writes, and I think he's a very beautiful and lyrical writer. So what I got cross with wasn't anything to do with how he writes, but I was quite taken by the fact that he kept harking back to men walkers, and apart from Nan Shepherd in that book, and I just thought that was a bit odd, and that just sort of noodled away at me, and thought, are there no women to draw on? What's going on here? So I started to do a bit more reading of other books about walking, and this pattern became really clear really quickly, that very few books talked about women walkers at all. Those that did were really dismissive, and those that engaged with women walkers did so within a page or two. So there was one book I read, and I'm not going to tell you who it was by, because it really annoyed me. It's 270 pages long, and 4 were devoted to women. One of them was Dorothy Wordsworth, and the other one was Virginia Woolf. And it just didn't seem to me sensible or plausible that there were no other women that were walking. So I just started rooting around, with my training as in archives and manuscripts. I just thought, okay, well, let's start there. Let's see what's in the archives, see what's going on. And bit by bit, reading books and finding leads, it very quickly became apparent there are actually lots of really interesting stories that women were walking as soon as walking became something that people did for pleasure, rather than as something you had to do because you had to get somewhere. That women were there from the beginning, and there was a richness to it, and there was all sorts of different reasons for women walking, and that sort of gradually then grew into the book. I sort of focused on a writer at a time and really got into them, and then wrote a chapter, and then went off and did the same thing again. But yeah, it's all Robert Macfarlane's fault. It's the headline for this.
Well, I mean, very interesting, because I mean, obviously in the responses to Robert Macfarlane's work, I mean, that issue has come up before, and Kathleen Jamie, who writes a beautiful foreword actually to your book, has written what's become quite a well-known essay, I think, on Robert Macfarlane. But it does feel to me that what you've been able to do through that work is establish this sort of alternative history of walking, and also a sort of sense of a tradition, if you like, of women walkers. And I just wondered if you might say a bit about that sort of sense of tradition. How do you feel part of that tradition? I mean, is this helpful to have identified these precedents running across 300 years?
Yeah, that sense of a tradition emerged sort of accidentally and sort of organically as the stories began to accumulate. And it wasn't really until I was talking to a friend, another romanticist, about the book, he told me off for getting knocked at Robert Macfarlane. So we're having a nice chat about the book and what it was trying to do. And it wasn't until he said, well, you're a woman walker too. Why don't you write about your experiences? That I hadn't really put myself into the story at all. But that really resonated with me. And from that point onwards, I was much more conscious of my own place and my own experiences as a walker, and how they had been inflected by being a woman and what that meant. But I had never really reflected on that at all, and not consciously, and not being aware that things were a bit different for me, but not really sort of theorizing or understanding that in any kind of way. So that emerged organically as the book progressed and as the stories accumulated. And I hadn't quite realised that what I'd got with the book was what Kathleen James Fulwood pointed out, was this sense of a tradition. And since I sort of finished the first draft of the book, that's become really important as an idea. And it's fed into other projects that have emerged since, and starting to wonder, well, what does it mean for women to have a knowledge of themselves as part of a tradition, to see themselves reflected in literature about this apparently very culturally important activity? You know, there's so many books about walking, and I'd never consciously reflected on what it must be to never see yourself in that, to never see yourself or people like you on the summits doing these amazing things, being celebrated for it. So that it wasn't an intention of the book when I set it, but I really hope that that's something that the book does now that it's complete. I wish I could claim more sort of overall design for that, but I think that's just something that emerged as the writing process happened. But that's really what I hope the book now manages to accomplish.
I mean, I think you're part of that tradition, as it were. Your walking yourself comes through very clearly. I mean, not just because you add your personal experiences at the end of the chapters, but also the narrative itself. You feel like you're taking us on a journey. We may be walking with these women in history, but you can feel, you know, the stony paths and the hills and the swampy, the swampy areas that they go over. I also find it fascinating when you talk about the circumstances of the lives, particularly of the four women, and the difference in walking experiences of men and women. That obviously was a revelation too. But again, as I say, I do like, it's a scholarly book, but it's also a personal book, and I do like too that you have opinions. You admire, you know, you openly admire people doing this. I have to say, your opening chapter where you talk about walking on the Anak Igak brought back memories that I clearly have suppressed. When I did it, I don't remember being quite so terrified, but thank you for reminding of that sort of thrilling experience. But for people who haven't read the book, and for people, particularly our four, I wonder if you could just sort of set the context, please, sort of say something about, you know, the type of walking they did, and the circumstances perhaps that led them to do it.
Sure, and all four really different and with different personal circumstances that shaped how and what they did. So with Dorothy Wordsworth, I think one of the key things that she does is walk the same place over and over and over and over again. And that extract that you were reading, Jeff, at the beginning, when, you know, she talks about John's Grove, you know, naming places that have become significant to her, to the family, to the friends that they have. I think that's a really important part of what Dorothy does. And I think that's really interesting for her status as a woman walker as well, because a lot of this is me getting annoyed at stuff. I think that's my whole research raison d'etre. I got quite cross that, you know, these men who are celebrated for their walking, they don't have childcare responsibilities. They don't have domestic responsibilities. Who's looking after the kids while Samuel Taylor Coleridge wanders off up Broad Stand? Obviously his wife. She just does that. That's just what happens because you're a man. You know, who looks after the house whilst William goes for a stroll? Dorothy, because that's just what happens. So Dorothy's walking is inflected by those domestic limitations. They're not restrictions. And I think the way that walking literature, as it has been written, tends to validate and celebrate the conquering of a peak, the long distance, the giant journey. Whereas what I think Dorothy's walking does is demonstrate the richness of the local and the close, the familiar and the domestic, because she walks to collect firewood, she walks to collect eggs, she goes to get the post. they're not grand epic tracks at all. She never goes to the, you know, she goes to the Alps with William, but she doesn't do the grand solo walk that he does. And for me, that's, especially in lockdown, actually, that's become really significant, is the way in which you can build meaning into your local area. So a lot of her walking is like that. But then as she gets older and I think gets a little bit freer from those domestic responsibilities, she then also goes off and does some really interesting walking tours. First of all with William and Samuel Taylor Coleridge up to Scotland, but then revisits that in 1822 with her sister-in-law, and goes to, you know, goes to various places. As I say, she goes to the Alps with William. So there's these larger walks, but always this idea of companionship. So her walking for me is really, really quite powerful, and that's one of the writers that I think I took most to my heart. And she stands in contrast to someone like Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt. Now, I did find some evidence to suggest that she was a competitive walker, but I could never find quite enough to make that into a thing in the book. But there's some sense that walking was really significant to her for a longer period than this very short journal that I write about in the book, which only covers a few months while she's in Edinburgh, being divorced by her husband in this horribly tawdry, sordid collusion where he's going to get caught in a brothel so that he can go off and marry the young lassie that he's fallen in love with. So her walking's got a completely different purpose. She's somewhere strange. She's had to come from London up to Edinburgh. She's about to become a single woman in a period where that's a really vulnerable position to be in. And she's friendless in this place that she doesn't know. Her husband's got friends all over the place, but she has none. So walking for her is cathartic. It's cleansing in various ways. She suffers from these bodily disorders that, you know, from 200 years later, you're not going to diagnose them, but there's a physical bodily response to what her husband is doing. And walking helps settle all of that down. It helps bring her control over her body. And the fact that she goes off on 2 solo tours to the Highlands, you know, just gets in a boat, sails up the Forth, and off she goes, is incredible. And she's so intrepid. I mean, she does follow the standard tourist route to a certain extent, but then she takes these crazy diversions, walking across the bogs between Loch Katrine and Loch Lomond, gets lost, finds a way, says, oh, that was great fun. Walks 30 odd miles a day, you know, takes almost no supplies, drinks from streams she happens to find, twists her ankle, walks anyway. That there's this real strength to her walking, a very powerful purposeness to her walking, almost this defiance about her walking that I think is really compelling. And as I say, a total contrast to what Dorothy's doing. And then someone like Ellen Wheaton, who had a very different sense of herself as a woman walker. I mean, you know, Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt just goes off and talks to people. She bumps into Scottish people and has chats and enjoys their company. And so does Dorothy to a certain extent. Whereas Ellen Wheaton's much more conscious of herself as being perhaps unusual, standing out, being the subject of gossip. And she's very anxious about that and wanting to blend in. So she walks on her own. She's very self-sufficient. And absolutely loves being independent on hills. And for her, it's the big peaks that she loves. She really does love climbing tall things and climbing up the hard way. You know, scrambling is her delight. She scorns people who don't come prepared. I think there's a lovely, when she climbs Fairfield with a big party, she's thought to bring hobnailed boots, so she's got some grip for the descent, but the rest of the party not so much, so they're slipping down and falling over. She has no sympathy with that at all, because she's a much more capable walker. So there's a different sense there, though perhaps in similarity to Sarah Stoddart has also personal difficulties. She marries a man who's abusive and violent, has to leave the marriage and the daughter that she has in that marriage because of the way the custody laws were then. And again, walking forms some sort of physical therapy, a space in which she can be free, a space in which she can exert control. That is really quite powerful. And she covers extraordinary distances. And perhaps there is a sort of a similarity with Dorothy, because she also stands on the Isle of Man and looks back at all of the peaks in the Lake District and goes, yes, I've climbed those, I've climbed all of those, and feels this enormous sense of personal satisfaction. And then you get someone like Harriet Martinez, who walks a lot as a young woman. She does a tour of Scotland with her brother. She walks a lot when she stays with her family in Dudley and Birmingham. and then has this mysterious illness that leaves her bedroom bound for 5 years. There's no diagnosing that from 200 years out, but it's such a contrast. And there's a sense she has early on that perhaps the walking was the problem, that's what's left her so ill. So it's quite surprising that when she is cured, she discovers mesmerism and finds herself suddenly physically released from whatever the illness was. And she just starts walking again. She starts with 1 mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, 10 miles, and starts measuring the distances as a way of measuring her recovery. So having gone from, well, walking's a bit dangerous to walking is how I make myself feel well, that's quite striking. And as part of the recovery, she visits a friend in the Lake District, falls in love with the lakes, and then moves to Ambleside, builds the knoll and settles in. And again, she's not just a peak lover, though she does love a peak. She wants to learn the lake, she says, and that's perhaps an extract I'll read later because it's one of my very favourites, is the way in which she says, I'm going to learn this place and I'll learn it by walking. So all 4 women, I think, have very different ways of walking, different reasons for walking, but there are similarities. But I think it's important that there is no one woman's way of walking as a woman any more than men walk in one way or other. And I think that's really lovely that there's such a disparate range of reasons, ways of understanding walking, ways of experiencing it. And those 4, I think they're absolutely terrific.
One of the things that really struck out for me was you mentioned about, if you like, what you need to have in place almost before you can do some of these walks. And you quote Rebecca Solnit, and it follows a passage where you talk about Dorothy commenting on the woman with a family on Loch Lomond, and she contrasts, doesn't she, her position and this woman's position, and she thinks maybe she has a choice. I wonder if I could ask you maybe to enlarge upon that, or even read that section. I found that fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I've got the section here. So this is from Dorothy's journal, and she says, the ferryman happened to be just ready at the moment to go over the lake with a poor man, his wife and child. The little girl, about 3 years old, cried all the way, terrified by the water. When we parted from this family, they going down the lake and we up it, I could not but think of the difference in our condition to that poor woman who, with her husband, had been driven from her home by want of work and was now going a long journey to seek it elsewhere. Every step was painful toil, for she had either her child to bear or a heavy burden. I walked as she did, but pleasure was my object, and if toil came along with it, even that was pleasure. Pleasure, at least, it would be in the remembrance. Mm-hmm. So I think that passage is, as you say, a really lovely illustration of the importance of social status, the importance of some sort of money as well. That's the difference between Dorothy and that woman, is the financial independence. She does, and also domestic independence. And there's those factors interconnect in interesting ways, that Dorothy does not have to have any domestic responsibility. She is unmarried. She is not a mother. She owes she doesn't owe anybody her labour. She chooses to give it to her brother, but she doesn't owe anybody that labour. Whereas this woman is bound by the title of wife and mother to perform certain functions. And that shapes quite considerably. There's no freedom, there's no joy in that kind of walking, with a child on your back, or being driven from your home by necessity. And I think that's a really powerful passage as well, because Dorothy's really good at reflecting on her position as a woman walker and the relationships she has with other women that she encounters. And there's another moment in the second Scottish tour, 20 years later, where she and her sister-in-law encounter a house full of women where one of the children has died, and she and Joanna are invited in and become part of the grieving community of this house. And they're invited in because they're walkers and they're going to get refreshment on the road, and the household does indeed offer them the refreshment that is typical. But this is a private feminine space that Dorothy is invited to enter into, and she's profoundly reverential of that and the significance of that. And I think there's a hint of it here in this earlier encounter, this sense of commonality, of empathy with other women that she encounters on the way. And I think a really nice reflectiveness and awareness of her own status. You know, not only does she have the money to not need to work, at least for wages, not only does she not have the domestic responsibilities that require, you know, hard walking rather than pleasurable walking, she also has the time to reflect on what her experiences are and what they mean. You know, pleasure would be at least in the remembrance. Is there anything about this walk that this poor woman is going to remember other than hardship and drudgery? Whereas Dorothy gets to reflect on those bigger ideas. You know, what am I? Why am I here? What is this for? So yeah, I think that's a really, there's a lot about Dorothy and how she relates to other women that she encounters.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is just in our family. We used to talk about that as type 2 fun. Is that a common term? It's kind of awful while you're doing it, but you have a good story about it afterwards. And it kind of makes it in remembrance. Elizabeth Walker's mentioned a passage that we just happen to have an image of, which I'd like to share. And I said I was going to share it. It's the come on computer. This is the trouble with doing these things live, isn't it? Well, the passage was, it's disappeared off my screen. The passage was that very passage from Dorothy's letter from 1794. I'm sorry, I can't just get it on the screen. So the 22-year-old Dorothy Wordsworth, living briefly with William in Windy Brow near Keswick, and she seems to have been reprimanded by one of her guardians, perhaps for walking when she shouldn't be. And Dorothy, in her defense, writes, "I cannot pass unnoticed that part of your letter in which you speak of my rambling about the country on foot," that's in quotes, "so far from considering this as a matter of condemnation, I rather thought it would have given my friends pleasure to hear that I had courage to make use of the strength with which nature has endowed me, when it not only procured me infinitely more pleasure than I should have received from sitting in a post-chaise, in other words, a carriage, but was also the means of saving me at least 30 shillings. So it's good for her, and it saves money. So that's Dorothy's, I guess, determination and Dorothy's independence all in one.
I love how she couches it though in the financially prudent way. That yes, I'm going to get pleasure from it, but it is domestically responsible of me to do it too. She covers every base there, doesn't she?
She does.
Leaves out crack and thought nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that comes out of the book really strongly, Kerry, is this sense, you know, not only of the people who see these women walkers and are sort of critical of them, as is the case with that, but also of people who just cannot comprehend what's going on. So you have a lovely quote from Harriet Martinez, who's talking about her walks around the Lake District with her younger relatives. And she says, "We walk over the whole country for days together, roaming with lightning on the mountaintops and astonishing the natives in the valleys." So there's this you know, sense of how it's the locals who are really taken aback. And there's simply a great moment with Wheaton, isn't there, where she comes down a mountain. A couple of times it happens with Wheaton, I think. She comes down a mountain, and one time there's a little girl who's just amazed to see a decently dressed woman there. And there's also a group of workmen who are just absolutely baffled, aren't they? And she herself says, you know, I must look a rather, I think her phrase is a singular figure, isn't it? A singular female. Yeah. Yeah,
and Elizabeth Carter too, earlier in the 18th century, gets, you know, her friends are just appalled by what she's doing. There's a pleasure tour they take along the coast in boats, and she decides she's going to walk back the extraordinary distance rather than take the boat back. And you can almost see their jaws just go, you know, why would you do that?
Yes.
But she doesn't care. And I think that's one of the nice things, that it's important to recognise that there were social attitudes that, you know, reflected poorly on women being out in the world, but they weren't enough to stop women from doing it. And I think it's been too easy, and this is certainly something I found in the books that I read early on about women's walking, that it's just too easy to make that assumption. Well, it was just dangerous, they just wouldn't have done it. Oh, it's just hard, they wouldn't have done it. Whereas the stories that I found were, well, yes, it was hard, And they did it anyway. Yes, it was a little frightening, and they did it anyway. And they found enormous meaning in doing it. And sometimes because it was dangerous, because it was subversive, because it was risky, there's enormous pleasure in that. The number of times the word wild comes up in the accounts, the love of it, the pleasure in it, of being wild, running wild, roaming wild, finding in walking a freedom from domestic and social constraints. So, and I think one of the things that Rebecca Solnit's Wanderlust is a terrific book, and if anybody hasn't read that, they really should. It's really great. But one of the things that she talks about there is the number of social restrictions that women faced, but also asks us to entertain a thought experiment where she says, well, what would have happened if John Muir had to wear full skirts? What would have happened if Aristotle was wearing a corset? You know, these other celebrated male walker writers. And of course, women are wearing those clothes. They are having to do these things, but they were still there. It wasn't enough to stop them. So I really like those moments where there's that when they do come up against other people's attitudes, and there's that really interesting engagement. And we'll perhaps talk a little bit about Ellen Wheaton and the guide on Snowdon, and the man, and doing the mansplaining at her, and how powerfully she resists that. That women aren't passive here, that they're not subjects of men's responses, men's violence, or societies, that they are actively participating in negotiating those boundaries in really interesting ways.
Thanks, Kerry. I think there's a lot we'll want to return to later. I know we've already got questions about equipment, which you mentioned there, or clothing as well, and the restrictions. So maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. And as you said, I'd love to talk to you about Ellen Wheaton on Snowdon. I mean, Wheaton seems to is a fascinating case study, I think, and it seems to particularly highlight one of the issues that runs through the whole book, which is this idea of the sort of the doubleness of walking alone, or the sort of emotional complexity of walking alone. Because, you know, as you point out, I mean, she says she preferred to walk alone. I think she says because her thoughts as well as her feet may ramble without restraint, which is a lovely idea of physical and mental freedom there, and the loss of restriction. But also she seems to be the one who is most conscious of, as you say, the sort of the transgressive, or the potential to be made uncomfortable because you are a woman walking alone. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about, you know, what seems to really be, as I say, this kind of like crux figure, the lone woman, and, you know, why that is both so empowering and so controversial.
Yeah, and this might be something that the questions might want to pick up. It's certainly something I've experienced as a walker, is that, and I think that still exists now, is that tension. And I can see one of the questions coming up now is just saying it wasn't necessarily dangerous for women to walk. It's social perceptions of what is the norm. And I think that's quite a lot of what is at work in that figure of the solitary female. And I've seen in discussions about motherhood and parenting that what is particularly powerful for women is the opportunity to be alone, to be quiet, to be away from demands. You know, mummy, I want that. When's tea ready? That there is enormous freedom. And whilst those domestic responsibilities or those personal responsibilities have changed in some ways, I think that's partly what's at work with Wheaton, is that being alone, so long as you are completely alone, you are away from society. And this is a little bit, so she's managed to climb Snowdon. We'll come back to the beginning on Snowdon, because that's just, as you say, a terrific moment. But she climbs Snowdon, and she says, here I stood, perched on a ridge like a crow, on the point of a pinnacle. Not a human creature could I see anywhere. For aught I knew, I had the whole mountain to myself. And I think that image of her, in some way she identifies with that crow, and the way she describes, you know, she's on a ridge like a crow on the point of a pinnacle. It's not just a pinnacle, it's the point of the pinnacle. It's the smallest possible contact with earth that you can possibly get away with and still be connected. And I think that resonates for me with how she sees climbing mountains, that it's a way of becoming as remotely connected to whatever else is going on as she can possibly manage whilst being a human. And she imagines herself into the body of the crow and imagines flying above the mountain and what that must feel like. So there's a longing for even more freedom. But the closest that she can get is to think of herself on tiptoes on this tiny, tiny little mountain point. And I think that idea of solitariness is enormously freeing. Where I think it becomes tricky for Wheaton is when she's doing that solitariness, when she's not quite alone. And then it becomes more contested, and she's certainly more conscious of what the social risks that she might be running here. So when she has the mountain to herself, I think solitariness is one of the most powerful sensations she is capable of feeling. It's just when it's not quite total, it then becomes an anxious space for her. And as I say, I think there's resonance for that in the way that women are still told about how they are to be in outdoor spaces. That those sorts of contested ideas still exist, but that image of her just, almost on the point of taking off, almost becoming a bird, is one of my favourite parts of her journals.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're getting lots of great questions in and points in, which we will pick up on. But I just wanted to, you used the word sort of connection there, and you were talking about connection with the crow at that point. Obviously, one of the great things that comes through the whole book is the sense of how connection is created through writing. And I guess one of the striking things about three of the writers that you look at is none of them were really writing for publication. But they were writing to communicate and to reflect, I guess. So the main forms I think that we've got are journals and letters. And I just wanted to quote a little bit from one of Wheaton's letters, which is to her friend Anne, which just captures a lot of the things you've been saying, but also illustrates this sense of how important connecting through writing is. She says, she's talking about the mountain scenes on I think she's on the Isle of Man at this point. She says, there's a simple grandeur and beauty in such scenes that infuses a greater portion of enthusiasm within me than I can express. I admire, I wonder, I adore. Oh, Anne, if you knew the pleasure I felt in running wild among such scenery, you would not wonder at my temerity or at my undergoing so much fatigue to obtain the gratification. So it just beautifully captures the things you've been saying, Kerry. On the one hand, the temerity, sort of the daring, possibly transgressiveness to do it, the work that goes into all of this, the fatigue as well, but also, this sense of admiration and wondering and adoration that's achieved not just by looking, but by running wild. And it's a great example of the running wild there. And I just wondered if you could say a bit about writing and the relationship between walking and writing, which comes across so powerfully in that moment.
Yeah, and I think the point you made there about these women not writing for publication, but that not meaning that it was private, is really, really important. Because I think that there are a lot of factors I think feed into the assumptions that we've made previously about what women didn't walk, or they couldn't walk, or they didn't like it. But I think part of the issue is, especially for the early histories like these, is that they weren't published, and they were never intended to be published. What they were was transcribed, copied, and circulated amongst a circle of friends. So they exist in this sort of strange in-between state between public and private. And because they don't go through that prestige process of a printing press and a formal publication, I don't think people have registered that they're there, that they are important, that they matter. I know, Simon, from your book, that you've come across other accounts that were private, and there's lots and lots of them out.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of material, isn't there, as you say? Yeah.
Yeah, and I selected walkers who were reflecting explicitly on the walking through writing, because that for me was the battle that I wanted to fight, was to say women walkers and writers, that these things mattered for women, these things together. When we celebrate Wordsworth for walking his poems backwards and forwards, when we celebrate Keats for touring Scotland, the same process is at work for women in different media, sure, in slightly different ways, sure, with different significance, sure, but it's still there and it still matters. So I think that idea of sharing, and I think that quotation from Wheaton that you just read out, demonstrates that part of the pleasure of this is companionship, and that's not necessarily on the hill, because solitariness, as I was saying, I think is enormously powerful, but there's still that sense of sharing, and that's, you know, Wheaton is writing back to her friends. Harriet Martineau, a lot of her walking is kept in, is recorded in letters to female friends. Elizabeth Carter, that's the only place where her walking is documented, is in these fantastically jolly, whimsical, slightly mad letters where she talks about her skirts becoming windmills and sweeping people up and wearing them out and leaving them for dead in the hedges. That's the only place where she communicates, is in that companionable, semi-public, semi-private space of the letter. So I think that's really important early on, when women's relationship with publishing is contested in the same sort of ways that their experience of being in the outdoors is contested, that there are social attitudes that are at work that women negotiate with, resist, but also, you know, sometimes conform to. That means that they choose forms that are a little bit different to men and tend not to have the same social prestige. But Dorothy is such a wonderful journalizer, is that a word? Journal keeper of her walks. And there's this beautiful moment where she's, and this sort of perhaps just to illustrate that point about walking, when she's walking with Joanna in Scotland, and it's just the two of them. And she gets so cross at Joanna because Joanna just isn't fast enough. Just it's disappointing in so many ways. I feel very bad for Joanna. And you know, I can't put this up on the screen, unfortunately, but the punctuation is just so terrific here. So Dorothy and Joanna are heading for Inveraray in Argyll. We set forward side by side at a very slow pace, dash, sunshine and gentle breezes. I push on, leaving my companion, dash, sit by the wayside to enjoy the pleasing scene. The lake very calm, dash, hardly to be heard. Sometimes a fisherman's boat with funereal sails is seen at a distance, and sometimes we hear the sound of oars on the water. Joanna passes me, dash, and a shower that has been threatening in front of us falls in heavy drops. I shelter under a bank. Joanna passes me, fearful of the damp, and when it was nearly over, I followed and found her standing within the threshold of a cottage. We separate often, dash, no more rain. How quiet the road. The lake so very still I cannot hear it, or any sound of water, except at intervals, rills trickling faintly. Joanna is far behind, dash. I hasten on for the burst of Inveraray. I'm reading out the dashes in that slightly awkward way because they play such an important part in this part of the journal. She doesn't usually write in the present tense, and she doesn't usually use dashes like that. And there's this really interesting way in which they serve to separate out the two sets of experiences as they pass and repass on the right. They're walking together, but they're not walking together. So that sort of absence of companionship, but also closeness, and then that being put into a journal that's meant to be shared with people who weren't there. There's a really interesting way in which the writing works there. You know, and this sort of stream of consciousness recording it in the moment. There's a spontaneity there, which is really interesting. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about for all 10 writers, is that relationship between walking and writing. And I think it's culturally important that we recognise that there is a really important relationship between them, as there is for men who walk and write. But I think it's also interesting and important to think about the form, and that's just a really, for me, that part of the journal, that's perhaps one of the moments where it really becomes evident, really clear that form and walking are going side by side, that the dash somehow stands in for Dorothy's steps in some sort of literary textual form.
Well,
that's absolutely fascinating, Kerry, and a very interesting point that is brought up that's just popped into the chat box just now from Yasmin Chopin. Says, do you think that Robert Macfarlane missed the achievements, exploits of women walkers because they chose to write it about in this liminal space between public and private? Perhaps if their work had been traditionally published, he would have noted them. And certainly, I mean, for me, working on Romantic period mountaineering, I felt I had to work a lot harder to find the writing by women than I did the writing by men, partly because it's not published in that way.
Yeah, I think you're right. But simultaneously, it's really easy. So what I found hard was identifying the women who walked. That was the trick, because no one spoke about them. But once you'd identified them, finding their work was a doddle. You know, Elizabeth Carter, typing into Google is Elizabeth Carter letters, up they come. Control F, walk. There it is. You know, hundreds and hundreds of entries. I mean, that's literally the research process. There's no glory in that for me at all. It was literally Control F and then read through the entries that came up. The only one that was hard was Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, because that's just in quite an obscure journal, and the only place I could get that was in the NLS. But Dorothy's journals have been beautifully published. You know, Pamela Woof's edition is freely, easily accessible.
Someone like Ellen Wheaton, I think, you know, who's a fantastic writer. You know, if I was recommending one of these writers and walkers to read, it would probably be Ellen Wheaton, who I found fantastic. I mean, her works should be much better known. I think, you know, there's an edition from the 60s that's not easy to get hold of. It's not affordable, is it? You need it from a sort of library. It still feels like there's a body of fantastic literature out there that could be much better known. I mean, Nan Shepherd being a great example of someone who, partly interestingly through Robert Macfarlane's championing, someone who, 10 years ago would be nowhere near as well known as she is now.
Yeah, though her reputation is a little bit more complex, because she was really well known in the 1930s in her own right. And her fame as a poet, as a playwright, making stuff up now, as a novelist and as a poet was really well established. She's an essential cultural figure. What I think, and this perhaps comes back to the question that's asked, is that this idea of publication, that is also something that is being taken as universal, when actually it's tended to be done by men. And I think that's a common theme, is that men's experiences have just been translated to be universal, when in fact they're actually really quite specific. So because men are socially authorized and expected to be public figures, it's much easier for them to publish. And because men are the socially validated sex in the 18th and 19th centuries, what they do is culturally approved of. So publishing then becomes prestige. And you can see what happens when women start writing novels. The novel goes downhill in reputation. When women start writing poetry, it becomes a stranger place. That when women get involved, it's men that are given the prestige. So I think it's not so much if they'd have been published, Macfarlane would have taken them seriously. It's that we've assumed that publication is what means you're serious. And we've not, and in exactly the same way that our understanding of walking has focused on peaks, on conquering, on these very male ideas of power and domination. Oh, that's what walking is. That's what culturally important walking must look like. No, that's a particular kind of walking. And actually, what has power for me is Dorothy Wordsworth's domestic walking. That's much resonant to my kind of lifestyle. Yeah, I love going off into the mountains, but I don't do that very often. The walking I do is out the back door with my son, or a half hour that I can steal here or there. That domestic walking makes much more sense, but because it's associated with women, we've not paid it very much heed. So I think there's a complicated interaction here between what we've made, assumptions that we've made about what women could do, and also cultural notions that we've assumed are universal when in fact are quite gender specific. And I think that plays through quite interestingly in Nan Shepherd as well as the other writers.
Well, for very good reason, we've talked past the break time. I think I'm going to make an executive decision that we just carry on. Otherwise, we'll be coming back for a relatively short period. But if that's all right with everybody, what I don't know that this might be a surprise to you, Kerry, and I'm hoping that the technology will work again, or work the first time. But I happen to have on the table that journal you were talking about with the dashes. So it's perfectly it will perfectly validate the point you were making if this camera works. Yes, it works. So what we have, the journal from 1822, there are 3 manuscripts of it, and one of them is this, if you can see that. So there is the little notebook that Dorothy carried with her on her walk and on the boats and on the carriages that she travelled in. And it's exactly what you say. Particularly towards the end, there's dashes. I hope does that focus enough? And you can see the dashes on the page.
That's
So there's a word, there's two words, and then there's a dash, and then there's another dash, and then there's another dash, and another dash. So you can, by looking at the manuscript, you can get that speed of writing and that sort of flow, the flow of consciousness almost that's pouring out onto the paper there. So it's a journal that you can see perhaps too that it's got some pencil, and she would write a passage perhaps in the hotel or the inn, and then the next day when she was on a travel, she'd write further in pencil, then she'd write over it in ink to sort of make it more of a fair copy. But what's also really nice at the beginning is that you get some accounts. Is that readable? Perhaps that's readable. Somebody tell me if that's readable. Is that readable, Simon?
That's readable, yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see things like washing and servants and dinners and books, I think, and something money spent at the Black Bull just there. But what I really love too is that you get the food that they've been eating, and I have to say it's not necessarily a healthy diet. There's not an energy bar in sight. So you've got mutton, pies, bread, coffee, sausages, bread, wine, tea, sausages, pies, and cakes. So that's lovely. It's a lovely insight into the lives, into that journal that they took. And so there's the opening. And as I say, you get the pencil writing, and then the inked over afterwards. So there was then a fair copy made. So she made a fair copy while she was on her journal, on a journey. So there's the beginnings of a fair copy. Slightly, well, it's all together a lot fainter, but clearly a neater copy put into, I guess, more normal sentences. And then when she came home, she then made another copy, a fair copy, and I guess it's this one that would then be circulated amongst the circle of friends. So there, if you like, is a beautiful copy, which may be again slightly out of focus, but you get a sense, I think, of just how much a grander document this one is. So there's Dorothy writing pages and pages of journal. So that's I guess in terms of the circulation of manuscripts at the time, that was the nearest Dorothy's manuscript would get to being published. So is that the first time you've seen that manuscript?
It is, yes. That's absolutely wonderful, and really fascinating to see the process between the in the moment journal writing and then how it becomes this copy that can be shared. I'm glad I'm not going to be editing or trying to edit that first copy. That looks quite ferocious. But I'm also very, very pleased to see that Dorothy's walking diet is very similar to mine. Lots of pies and lots of cake.
That's beautiful, isn't it? What they had. I mean, if anybody is interested to have a page or two, our manuscripts are digitized, so we'd be very happy to send people a few pages. They can have a go at reading it themselves if they would like to. But it is published. I don't know whether I'll move Dorothy's out of the way. But it was published by a Japanese scholar. So if anybody is interested in reading that actually has transcribed all the manuscripts, so you can read each version of it. So that's yeah, it's quite something. But one of the things that you mentioned in Dorothy's writing too is these returns and the importance of returning. And even in that journal, she's reliving moments, isn't she, that she travelled with William, and she's almost scolding herself in some places. I think she gets to somewhere like rest and be thankful, and she can't just remember it. She can't just remember it, so she kind of scolds herself for her memory letting her down. And then she realizes I've actually just changed the direction of the road to improve the road. And so she kind of, if you like, allows herself. But I think in your book, Kerry, you even mentioned, you particularly mentioned the late poems, where Dorothy revisits the poems in her memory, doesn't she, while at Rydal Mount, and more housebound in older age.
Yes, and thoughts on my sick bed, and I think that's a really interesting poem because it recalls all of these earlier memories, and you can see that process happening from the very moment she arrives in Grasmere. And I've got a quotation here, which I think sums up what happens early on. So it's 1802, it's January, they've been in Dove Cottage for a couple of years. And she says, William had slept very ill. He was tired and had a bad headache. We walked around the two lakes. Grasmere was very soft and Rydal was extremely beautiful from the pasture side. Nabscar was just topped by a cloud, which, cutting it off as high as it could be cut off, made the mountain look uncommonly lofty. We sat down a long time in different places. I always loved to walk that way because it is the first way I first came to Rydal and Grasmere, and because our dear Coleridge did also. When I came with William 6.5 years ago, it was just at sunset. There was a rich yellow light on the waters and the islands were reflected there. Today it was grave and soft, but not perfectly calm. William says it was much such a day as when Coleridge came with him. The sun shone out before we reached Grasmere. We sat by the roadside at the foot of the lake, close to Mary's dear name, which she had cut herself upon the stone. Now, that's at least 4 times she's walked here, and I would imagine many, many more than that. And what I think is really fascinating about how Dorothy rewalks is that layering. There's literal layers of memory here that sort of comes back down through, you know, all the way back to the first time 6.5 years ago when Coleridge was here, when Mary did that on the rock, when I walked with William, when I came here on my own, and it just accretes. You know, there's this meaning. The place just, you know, just accumulates significance, and I think one of the most poignant moments that happens is when she and William walk up to Dunmail Raise with their brother and see him off, and it turns out that this will be the last time that they ever see him. And it's desperately sad that he drowns in a shipwreck a few months afterwards. But Dorothy comes back there deliberately so that she can re-embody that experience, to re-inhabit the space that he existed in that memory. She does it knowing it's going to bring her pain. She doesn't knowing she's going to grieve again. And that's important. And that's part of the point, is so that she can be there with him again. And so there's this, all these places become laden with significance, and I think one of the really lovely things about Dorothy's later poetry is that she takes those meanings, so she can no longer walk in these places, but the meanings that they've acquired in her memory then become substantial, as in having substance. They become real. The memories then become the thing. And the way in which she articulates that through her poetry, I think, is a fascinating sort of re-embodiment of all those, you know, long layered memories that she sort of places in the landscape.
It's very interesting, if I can just come in there, just a very interesting question which sort of touches on this, which comes from Judith Thompson, and she says, when I taught Dorothy Wordsworth in my Walking Words class years ago, I was struck by her walking as a form of gathering, whether eggs or plants or impressions. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's a really lovely idea of thinking about it, as sort of harvesting. But I think it's there's two-directional. She absolutely takes things from the moment. So she gathers eggs, she gathers firewood, she gathers mushrooms, she gathers post. You know, there's that taking. But at the same time, she also leaves memories, she leaves emotions, she leaves thoughts behind. That there's this sort of transaction that happens. Transaction is not the right word, but there's a reciprocity to that, which I think is really beautiful. So as she removes things from the landscape, she puts something else back, and she's able to then return to that place and pick that up and take it in herself and put it back and then add something more to it. There's this really interesting way in which that gathering happens. It doesn't take things away. It's a gathering that kind of adds, and
Mm.
I'm sure there's a really lovely, philosophically sensible way of putting that. I'm just going to go with that's really beautiful.
So it's almost like an exchange of gifts, isn't it?
Yeah, but a source of gift that never ever runs out.
And the gifts get greater for the giving, you're suggesting. Yeah, lovely.
Just to pick up again another question, this one's from Janet. Kerry mentions hobnail boots as suitable walking attire. How far did fashions and acceptable women's clothing constrain them, and how did they overcome this? And I guess another question that might sort of go along with that is a question of equipment overall. I think Sarah Stoddart talks about her shoes being worn out as a result of a walk, and you talk about Harriet Martinez talks about in 3 minutes we were wet through and through, waterproof knapsacks and all. So I wonder, Kerry, if you might be able to just say a little something about equipment and clothing and general things like that, material things, if you like.
Yeah, I am not the expert on walking clothing in this period. There are actual bona fide experts. Kat Young-Nicol is a really interesting person to look at, who's done actual work on this, whereas I'm a dilettante. But my understanding is that they wore fairly standard clothing, so skirts and adapted shoes. And I mean, Dorothy Wordsworth made the family shoes, so I imagine that's what they walked in, was the shoes that she handmade. So we're not necessarily talking about specialist equipment at all. There was when I was researching the book, I found a story of Barbara Beaudeschamps, who was one of the founded Girton College in Cambridge, an eccentric figure, made financially independent by her father, really extraordinary woman, who went walking in the continent with her female companion. And I read a story in a book about her that they ripped off their skirts and actually went around in breeches and full boots, but I couldn't ever find actually, because this account quoted a manuscript. So I went to Girton College to get the manuscript, and there was nothing of that kind there, which was really unfortunate, because I'd love that to be true, that they just sort of tore off their traditional women's clothing and wore breeches instead. But it looks like that's apocryphal. But in the early 20th century, I think that is what started to happen, that women would climb mountains to a certain point, and then when they were far enough away from, you know, a lot of people seeing them, would then transfer into something a bit more practical. But I've got Harriet Martinez here. So this is her in her guide to the Lake District, her complete guide to the Lake District, and instructing as a walking guide how you're to climb the hills. And she says, someone coming to Westmoreland must spend a day on the mountains, and if alone, so much the better. Because if he knows what is to spend a day so far above the everyday world, he is aware that it is good to be alone. He must go equipped with a stout stick, a knapsack for provisions, a map to explain to him what he sees, and a pocket compass in case of sudden fog. And he must take a copy of her guide with him as well. So a certain amount of practicality, so a bag, some sort of walking stick. But I think what people wore and what they used varied quite significantly. I don't think Sarah Stoddart took anything with her. Yeah, almost no food. She didn't take any water. She drank from streams, and she talks about being extraordinarily parched sometimes before she finds a water source. So she had almost nothing with her. She walked through bogs in just, you know, full skirts and maybe hobnail boots, and that was it. So, you know, I hate going out and getting wet in my Gore-Tex. So these walkers are so much hardier than me. You know, I'd have been sobbing in a field before I got through half of what they managed. So I don't think there's a walking costume that anybody adapts. I think it's all adaptations of whatever clothes were to hand, adapted according to social circumstance and also personal preference. And Sarah Stoddart has that, just being, you know, I don't need anything, I'm fine, that will do. Harriet Martinez being quite different. That's a recognisable list of walking equipment. So, you know, I think there's just 20 odd years separating them. So, yeah, quite a lot of variety, I think.
I mean, I think Simon mentioned that he sort of favoured Ellen Wheaton's, as it were. I was really struck by Sarah Stoddart's walk, and particularly from Loch Katrine over to Loch Lomond, and she gets caught in a storm, and it's just, she gets there later. I mean, luckily it was May; it must have been a light night, but it's a remarkable achievement, and as you say, in that walk where she becomes parched and she finds water, and it brings her closer to religion, doesn't she? She talks about that experience bringing her closer to God.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think for Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, suffering is part of the point. That being aesthetic is part of the point. That when she comes back from her first tour and she washes her feet, the physical pleasure she takes in that, and how the fatigue almost vanishes because, you know, she's finally getting clean. But earlier in that walk, when she's crossing over that bog between Loch Katrine and Loch Lomond with no idea where she's going, you know, she suffers that, and then she feels elated. She finally gets to accommodation and she's exhilarated by what she's accomplished. So the fact that so there is something of that sort of suffering Christian, I think, that makes this more to do with the intellect. You know, she's been treated appallingly by her husband. She's treated as an inconvenience, a piece of luggage to be got rid of. And here she can dictate the exact amount of bodily suffering that she endures. She is in total control of what happens to her body. And I think that's a really powerful thing for her to have, that bodily control, even though it comes across to us as really quite extraordinarily extreme. You know, I have to have 4 litres of water for a hill walk, and preferably, you know, several tons of chocolate, and she makes do with perhaps a crust of bread and apple and no water at all. It's a total contrast.
And rubs whiskey into her sprained ankle,
and then walks in and then carries on walking. Yes. Yes, I've not tried that cure. I like to drink it rather than you know, massage myself with it, so maybe that's where I've been going wrong.
We've had a number of general comments and questions, Kerry, on this sort of issue that you're raising there, which were initially people talking about sort of therapeutic walking. And I suppose generally the sense of, you know, walking in relation to, you know, well-being, both physical and mental. And I mean, you're suggesting almost that I think that, you know, different women found different ways in which they could produce that sense of physical or mental well-being.
Yeah, I want to be very careful about saying anything that, you know, walking doesn't cure all ills. It's not going to fix your depression. It's not going. If you can't walk, you're not inevitably going to get sick. There's no nature cure that I'm aware of that does those things. But what I think happens for these women is that they find through walking a way to explore or understand or incorporate some really quite profoundly difficult experiences and emotions. I mean, Dorothy's complex relationship with her brother, especially when he gets married, and the strength of those feelings, they become more manageable for her through walking. And the same with Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt. There's these profoundly disturbing personal events happening, and through walking she's able to find some sort of accommodation with those. So I don't think walking is therapy for any of these women in particular, but I think the act of being alone, of being in the outside, of being in control of themselves is the answer for them, because a lot of their problems are socially determined. They're through their relationships with men, they're through their relationships with other people, and being alone in the hills clears all of that out. And I think that's a really important part of why they walk is that opportunity to enter into their own internal worlds, I think, in peace and quiet, which I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Wheaton is so cross when the guide just insists on, you need to go here, you need to go here. She's like, I'm fine.
Well, I mean, maybe now would be a good time for you to tell us about that moment, because for me that's one of the highlights of the book.
Yeah, it's such an extraordinary moment. So just to set this into context for anyone who hasn't either read Wheaton or read my book.
There are a lot of fans of Wheaton on the chat, by the way. She seems already to have a strong kind of sense of followers. Yeah. Excellent.
I am very keen on a Wheaton fan club. She's absolutely amazing. So she sets off on a tour of North Wales. It's not just snow. She sets off on a walking tour of North Wales on her own. And earlier in her journal, she also writes about wanting to walk Wales on her own, the whole thing, like Wordsworth did, only she's not confident about finding the accommodation. You know, she can't just walk up to people and sleep in their houses. But she does eventually get out onto this walk, and she's well prepared. She's got a walking guide. She knows what she's doing. She's an experienced walker. And she sets out up the hill, and she's knocked on the guide's door, but he's not in. And it was fairly standard for people, men and women, to use guides at this point. So that's not necessarily in itself unusual, but she has decided that she's going to be fine. And then just setting off on this climb, she encounters the guide coming back down. And the guide, seeing I was out of the path, only because he was in it, if he had but known, called out to me, but I was quite deaf. He continued shouting, and I was forced to hear. He was telling me to keep in the copper path, etc. I knew the way perfectly well, for my map and my guide had been well studied at home. I could find from what the gentleman said that he imagined I had called for the guide at his dwelling, and finding him engaged upon the mountain had gone so far to meet him, for he entreated the man to leave him. I never turned my face towards them, but walked as fast as I could, the guide again giving me some directions, with the best intentions, I am sure.
It's another great moment where the woman walker is just absolutely, the person who sees it just cannot comprehend her. I mean, she just sort of makes no sense to the guide. We've got, I might ask you another question if that's okay. So Trish.
In that moment, I don't think. So I was just, sorry, my internet connection I think broke down there. What I was just going to say was that I don't think what makes it exceptional for this person is that she's a woman, it's that she's walking without a guide. Well, wouldn't you want the guide? I needed the guide, you would want the guide. And she said, no, I'm fine. So I think that's, in that moment, that's what makes it an extraordinary thing, is it's not so much her sex, so much as her, you know, she's going to do this mountain all by herself. Sorry for interrupting you there, Simon.
No, not at all, not at all. I was just going to see if we had time to squeeze in a few more questions, because you know, there's obviously lots of things people want to ask you. I've got one here from Trish Breda. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But it's quite a broad question, but it touches on the sort of conception of the book, really. She says, I'm doing some work on everyday walking in women's diaries, which raises for me a question related to Yasmin's. At what point does walking become significant, remarkable, or transgressive? And a more specific question for Kerry, how do you choose which women to write on? And then she said, yes, everyone should be reading Wheaton. She's got two questions there. One about what makes for remarkable women, or transgressive ones, though in a way you've touched on that. And also then, yeah, how do you choose which women to write on?
So I think, I mean, walking becomes transgressive when it's more to do with class, I think, at the beginning, than it is to do with gender. That anybody who can uses a horse. You know, people don't walk for pleasure unless they have to. So there's paths near where I live in the Scottish border that were for trade. You know, there's a route called the Herring Road, which runs between the border's coast and the inland towns, where women and traders would pass with goods to and fro. So that's the sort of walking that was acceptable. If you were wandering around though without a purpose, then you were a vagabond, and if you couldn't give a good account of yourself, you would be taken up. You would be, you know, taken before a judge. So walking as without a good purpose is always transgressive. Whether that's a man or a woman, that's not a gendered thing. What I think starts to make people quite twitchy is when you start to see people who are walking without an apparent purpose. They're walking for pleasure and they're walking for leisure. And there's a period, I think, where those ideas are in tension. You say, well, why are you out? Because walking for leisure still hasn't quite caught on. It's just at the beginning. And that's to do with class. It really isn't to do with gender, because women, just like any other working person, would have had to have moved around the land on foot. You know, they're going to market, they're going to collect water, they're moving between villages, whatever it is that they're doing, you know, women of a certain social status are doing that on foot. So I think it's at this transition where people start to appear in the landscape where normally people don't appear in the landscape. And Elizabeth Carter, that's one of my favourite bits of Carter, actually, is when she talks about desperately wanting to be taken for a vagabond. You know, she wants to be mistaken for somebody who is walking around with no purpose, and looks rough enough to be walking around with no purpose, but she never quite is. So that's where the transgression really lies, I I think, at the beginning. Later on, ideas about propriety and women's behaviour, I think that comes from a slightly different place. But yeah, the original transgression was social status. So yes, there was a second question, and I got distracted by the Wheaton family.
Oh, how do you choose the women you work on?
So for this book, I set myself quite a tight methodology, which was that the women I covered had to reflect extensively on their walking in their writing, because that, as I say, that was the cultural battleground I thought was the important one to fight first, was to say that walking has cultural significance for women because they are writers. That matters. So that excluded a surprising number of really interesting people. So I was quite sad that I didn't manage to include Mary Wollstonecraft in particular. She writes, so she goes off to Scandinavia and this sort of strangely secretive mission that's perhaps commissioned by her former lover. And she goes with her young infant daughter. And her relationship with Imlay, her lover, has collapsed. She's doing this dangerous work. This is not somewhere where people go, never mind women. And she's ruminating on what it means to have brought a daughter into this world that is not kind to girls or women, what this relationship with Imlay means. And she goes for these contemplative walks along the Scandinavian cliffs, which are very beautiful, but they're so short. There's just these few sentences. And there's like, oh, please, come on. And her daughter, Mary Shelley, also goes on a tour in Europe, but doesn't really talk about the importance of the walking. So they didn't get in. And then Jane Austen, I mean, I know she walked. Lizzie Bennet is my favourite walking character. And her letters record the walks, but all she says is, I went for a walk. Like, really? That's it? So there were, if you wanted to write a book about women who just walked, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds to choose from. But because I set myself this, they had to write about their walking, that narrowed it down quite significantly. But there are hundreds of other stories to tell. Absolutely extraordinary people. Flora Thompson, who wrote the Lark Rise to Candleford novels, was a postwoman. She's walking all over the place. But doesn't reflect on it. So there's so many other characters out there, but that's how I chose the 10 for this book.
Thank you. We should say there's a great appendix at the back of the book in which you do talk about all these other women who, could in another version have gone into it. So that's a lovely addition to have there.
There's a question. Sorry. There's a question which comes in about. I mean, a lot of the writing of the period of travel writing can seem sort of quite cliched after a time, and the writing of the four that we're focused on seems very original. And there's a question sort of on that line about the thoughts about the relationships of both the writing and the walking to contemporary visual culture and picturesque sketching, for example. But this seems very unformulaic in a way that picturesque sketching and writing might be.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's partly because I think these women aren't writing travel books, or they're not writing to tell other people of where they've been. You can see in Sarah Stoddart has the influence of those sorts of texts. She does at various points undertake a reasonably standard tourist route and then does something mad and goes off in a crazy direction. But there are, she goes to see the Falls of Leddy, which is on a standard tourist route. Loch Katrine, standard tourist route. And the way in which she talks about some of those places is quite formulaic. But the way she writes for herself about her walking is far from that. But she never intended that journal to be published. It is just for herself. So I think when you're not writing for an audience that expects certain things because of the genre that you're writing in, I think these women are freed from those sorts of constraints. Which isn't to say that there aren't gestures in those directions, because Dorothy Wordsworth, for instance, her journals do take a certain form and do certain things, but they're not intended for mass consumption at all. So they can just be what they want them to be. There's none of those commercial pressures, and I think that's a really nice side effect of not publishing is that freedom that it brings.
I've got a very interesting question from Catherine Thomas, Kerry, who is asking about the later writers in the book. So interesting to touch on those, because obviously there's an awful lot of material in the book that we've not been able to talk about tonight. But she says, do any of the later writers you include in your study, Kerry, show awareness of any of the women that walked before them, as it were? By that I mean, do their text journals, letters on writing contain discussion of them? I'm thinking maybe Woolf.
Yes, some of them do, and actually some of the earlier ones. So Elizabeth Carter, who is walking in the 1740s and 50s, some of her friends walk, and she takes their accounts of their walking with her on her walks. They have difficulty meeting up, they live a long way apart. So that's one of the ways in which she takes her friends with her, is to take their walking. So there's this sense of sort of communal activity there, which is really interesting. I think Harriet Martinez is probably the first one that really does it quite explicitly, and that's because she's got the model of Dorothy Wordsworth to draw on. So there's a really interesting moment in Martineau's letters where she becomes friends with the Wordsworths because she's living next door basically, and she talks to William Wordsworth, and by this point Dorothy's become quite ill, and the family are blaming Dorothy's penchant for long distance walking on her mental and physical decline, and it warns Martineau about that. So Martineau's got this sort of uneasy role model of Dorothy, because Martineau really does love walking huge distances, but right in front of her is this, and her own personal experience of illness was part, she suspected that was because of her walking. So that's quite an interesting and fraught relationship. But sort of moving later, probably Linda Cracknell is the one that does it the most explicitly, and she deliberately goes off into the places where these women walked, and she does that with Dorothy Wordsworth. She goes to the Birks of Aberfeldy, which and Cracknell lives in Aberfeldy. This is her home walk, and Dorothy writes about this in the first tour that she takes with William and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Cracknell tries to occupy the same space. And that attempt is frustrated in part because the place is so dominated by Burns, and there's this slightly tatty, twee statue of Burns because he wrote a poem about the Birks, but there's nothing to Dorothy, who also wrote really interestingly and powerfully about the place. So there's this sort of very in-your-face man presence, and Cracknell writes really interestingly about the experience of trying to then bring forward these female archetypes, this female tradition. So I think that's a lovely moment when the accretion of meaning in a place gets a bit messy and a bit tangled, because the wrong role models are sitting prominently. So yeah, it's not something that all of them do, but it's certainly for me, knowing about these people now, it's something that I think about when I go walking, is these women are with me. I am conscious of myself as a woman in the landscape, and maybe that's something that will come. Now we know that there is a tradition, that maybe that will be something that starts to happen in women's writing about walking, but it's patchy and sometimes a little bit strange in the writers that I cover in my book.
It's nice, your personal chapters, your personal sections at the end of each chapter suggest that the women are with you spiritually, and sometimes in the very same place. As I say, you're sitting on Ben Lomond thinking about Sarah walking by. There's a really nice comment from Alison Gilchrist, which you because you've been talking, you may not have seen, about walking and revisiting places, coming to the Lake District, and it's just gone off my screen. But it's where's Alison's comment gone? She says, yes, by re-walking these routes, I revisit these with old and new friends or alone, and feel as if my entire life is held in these hills. I mean, that's just such a lovely thought. We've got a couple of minutes left. We must just ask you, Kerry, about the Women in the Hills project. If you were able to say a little bit about that, or have you
Sure.
You're back.
So yes, when I mentioned that this idea of female tradition had become important to me, sort of by accident, as I say, I wish I'd set out with that in mind when I wrote the book, or started to write the book. But having now written the book, and also knowing Rachel Hewitt, who's at Newcastle, who's writing a book about women mountaineers, and Jo Taylor, who recreated Dorothy's ascent to Scafell Pike in 1818 in full costume, which is in the rain, which was a level of heroism beyond me entirely. That part of what we started to get interested in when we first started talking was what happens when you return women's stories, when women's histories of walking and being in the outdoors and being in the uplands. What happens when you put those back into the history that we've got? What does that do to people? And from that emerged this idea that, well, it would be really interesting to see why or how women are accessing the upland landscapes now. So we came up with the idea of doing a network, so getting lots and lots of different kinds of people together, so scholars and academics, and writers like us, but also people who run trail running companies, landowners, charities that own land, kit makers, experts in women's physical and pelvic health, all sorts of folk to get access to the uplands, because there's lots of research to suggest that women don't get out there as much as men do by any stretch of the imagination, and there are some outdoor activities where women's participation is minimal. So we wanted to explore those social factors, but driving us was this interest in, what would it be easier for women to access the landscape if they knew that they always belonged there? We got hit by COVID, unfortunately. We just had our first project meeting in January, and we were about to have our first event when the pandemic hit. And then Rachel's got 3 young children, I've got a young child, so we had all sorts of put on hold. And I'm now pregnant with my second child, so it's been put on hold a bit more, but we're hoping to start things up again next year and get the network going again. So that will hopefully be a forum for talking about some of the things that we've talked about tonight, the effects of women's equipment, what were women doing in the landscape, what were the ideas about what women were supposed to be, all the sorts of things that we've been talking about tonight are going to be things that we want to explore further.
You have already built a great website, haven't you? So, I mean, I think if people just type "is it Women in the Hills" into Google, that'll take them to the website. And I'm sure, there's a blog on there. There's further reading. There's lots of material that I think a lot of our participants would
get that built before the pandemic. And we're also on Twitter at Women in the Hills. So if you want to give us a follow there, as the network starts to get itself going again, there will be more and more things to follow there. So there'll be opportunities to participate, but it will probably be the middle of next year before meaningful activity is possible. So watch this space, it is coming.
Well, we hope to be part of that meaningful activity as part of the project, perhaps feeding into our Dorothy Wordsworth exhibition for next year. I was with Joe on that expedition in the cold and the rain, and it was really interesting because there was one of the people with us who played one of the manservants, as it were, Miss Sarah Barker's manservant, had a bowler hat and a tweed jacket, and he came off that mountain far drier than I did, with Gore-Tex coat and trousers. So there's something to be said for the traditional materials. We do have to draw it to a close. I can see from the chat that several people are either intending to buy your book. Someone's even bought it during the webinar, which is fantastic. It's traditional at this point to encourage people to buy the book. I don't think we need to do any of that. I think from this conversation, people will say what a wonderful read it is. You've brought a book that's full of life. Really to life in itself. In conversation, it's even more alive. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. Before we finish, I will just say thank you to Hannah for arranging this evening. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's made a comment or asked a question. Really sorry that we couldn't necessarily answer every one or even keep up. It's been a fantastic conversation. I think the liveliest conversation we've had in this series so far. Next, in a fortnight's time, we have Rob Morrison talking with us in conversation. This is his book, Regency Years. It's got the most fantastic strapline, during which Jane Austen writes, Napoleon fights, Byron makes love, and Britain becomes modern. So what's not to like about that? So I hope you can join us again next time. But in the meantime, thank you again, Kerry. That was just the most fantastic event. Thank you for your energy and your insights, and just your sheer enthusiasm for such a wonderful topic. Thank you so much. So
thank you for having me, sharing the collection as well. That was absolutely extraordinary. Thank you so much.
That was a pleasure. And as I say, if anybody would like an image or two from that manuscript, we're very happy to send it, and you can have a go at reading it. So I think we just very happy to say good night and hopefully see you next time.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye everyone. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, Kerry.
Bye.